Ocean basins occupy defined positions across the planet, forming a continuous arrangement of enclosed and semi-enclosed depressions. Their geometry is described through measurable boundaries, relative spacing, and large-scale spatial proportions. Distribution patterns persist within a stable global framework that connects individual basins without isolating them from the larger oceanic structure. The Pacific Ocean Basin occupies the largest continuous oceanic area on Earth. It extends across both the northern and southern hemispheres. The basin is bounded by continental margins of Asia and Australia to the west, and by the Americas to the east. Its northern extent reaches toward the Arctic region through the Bering Strait area. Its southern reach connects with the waters surrounding Antarctica. The Pacific Ocean Basin spans a broad longitudinal range, covering nearly 1/3 of the planet's surface. It lies between the western coasts of North and South America and the eastern coasts of Asia and Australia. The equatorial line crosses the central portion of the basin. Large portions of the basin are distributed symmetrically across hemispheric divisions. The basin includes widely recognized marginal seas in the western Pacific region. It also contains extensive open ocean areas across central sectors. Island arcs and archipelagic regions are dispersed across its western and central zones. The eastern boundary is comparatively linear along the American continental margins. The Pacific Ocean Basin forms a primary component of the global oceanic framework. Its hemispheric distribution integrates northern and southern oceanic domains. The basin's geographic placement establishes a continuous marine expanse between major continental landmasses. The basin extends from high northern latitudes across equatorial regions into high southern latitudes. It occupies a central position between Asia, Australia, and the American continents. Major subregions are commonly identified as the North Pacific and the South Pacific. The division between these subregions corresponds to the equatorial zone. The basin interfaces with the Indian Ocean to the southwest and with the Southern Ocean along its southern perimeter. The western Pacific margin contains numerous semi-enclosed seas adjacent to East and Southeast Asia. The eastern Pacific margin follows the continental outline of the Americas across both hemispheres. The Atlantic Ocean Basin occupies a longitudinal corridor between the Americas to the west and Europe and Africa to the east. It extends from the Arctic region in the north to the Southern Ocean in the south. The basin spans both the northern and southern hemispheres. Its general orientation follows a north-south alignment. The equatorial line crosses the central portion of the Atlantic Basin. The basin is commonly divided into the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. This division corresponds to hemispheric placement relative to the equator. The northern sector interfaces with the Arctic Ocean through defined marine passages. The southern sector connects with circumpolar waters surrounding Antarctica. The western boundary of the Atlantic follows the eastern coastlines of North and South America. The eastern boundary traces the western margins of Europe and Africa. The basin narrows in certain tropical latitudes and widens across higher latitudes in both hemispheres. Numerous marginal seas are situated along its continental margins, including those adjacent to the Caribbean region and the Mediterranean region. The Atlantic Ocean Basin forms a central component of the global ocean framework. It separates major continental landmasses across both hemispheres. Its spatial position establishes a continuous marine domain linking polar and equatorial zones. The basin's geographic configuration contributes to its recognition as one of the principal named ocean basins on Earth. The Indian Ocean Basin occupies a marine region bordered by Africa to the west, Asia to the north, and Australia to the east. It extends southward toward the Southern Ocean. The basin lies primarily in the Eastern Hemisphere. A substantial portion of its area is situated in the Southern Hemisphere. The equatorial line crosses the northern part of the basin. The northern boundary is largely enclosed by continental landmasses. The basin opens broadly towards southern high latitudes. Its overall configuration forms a triangular outline that widens toward the south. The western margin follows the eastern coastline of Africa. The northern margin aligns with the southern coasts of Asia, including the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian subcontinent. The eastern boundary traces the western coastline of Australia and the Indian Ocean archipelago. Several marginal seas are positioned along its northern and eastern sectors. The Indian Ocean basin connects with the Atlantic Ocean around the southern tip of Africa. It interfaces with the Pacific Ocean through passages within the Indonesian region. The basin forms one of the major named oceanic divisions in the global framework. Its geographic placement links equatorial regions with southern circumpolar waters. The Indian Ocean basin constitutes a distinct component of global ocean distribution across hemispheric divisions. The basin occupies a central position between Eastern Africa and Western Australia. Major subregions are commonly identified as the Arabian Sea in the northwest and the Bay of Bengal in the northeast. The southern boundary aligns with latitudes commonly associated with the Southern Ocean. The Indian Ocean basin spans tropical, subtropical, and temperate latitudinal zones across both hemispheric divisions. The Southern Ocean basin encircles the Antarctic continent. It occupies high southern latitudes across all longitudinal sectors. The basin is situated entirely within the southern hemisphere. Its northern boundary is commonly aligned with the circumpolar latitude near 60 degrees south. The Southern Ocean basin forms a continuous marine ring surrounding Antarctica. It interfaces with the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean basins along its outer perimeter. These adjoining basins converge along its northern margin. The Southern Ocean basin connects multiple oceanic sectors across a shared latitudinal band. The basin extends around the full circumference of the Antarctic landmass. Its geographic configuration is defined by polar placement rather than by continental separation. The Southern Ocean basin occupies a zonal position that spans all meridians. It is distributed evenly around the southern polar region. No continental barriers interrupt its encircling structure. The basin remains distinct due to its circumpolar alignment. Its hemispheric position situates it as the southernmost named ocean basin. The Southern Ocean basin represents a defined component of the global ocean framework across polar latitudes. The basin lies south of the southern tips of South America, Africa, and Australia. It extends uninterrupted across the Drake Passage region and across southern sectors adjacent to the Cape of Good Hope and Tasmania. The Southern Ocean basin spans all longitudes in a continuous band. Its placement establishes a marine domain that encircles Antarctica without interruption by continental landmasses. The Arctic Ocean basin occupies the high northern latitudes surrounding the North Pole. It is situated entirely within the northern hemisphere. The basin is bordered by the northern coasts of North America, Greenland, Europe, and Asia. Its geographic placement forms a largely enclosed marine region. The Arctic Ocean basin is connected to the Atlantic Ocean through the Greenland Sea and the Norwegian Sea. It interfaces with the Pacific Ocean through the Bering Strait. These connections link the basin to adjacent oceanic domains. The basin remains distinct due to its polar position and surrounding continental margins. The Arctic Ocean basin spans all longitudes around the northern polar region. Its central area is positioned near the geographic North Pole. The basin is comparatively compact relative to other named ocean basins. Numerous marginal seas are situated along its continental edges, including the Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, and the Beaufort Sea. The basin is distributed across northern sectors of both the eastern and western hemispheres. Greenland occupies a prominent position along its central western margin. The Arctic Ocean Basin forms one of the 5 major named ocean basins within the global ocean framework. Its hemispheric placement establishes it as the northernmost component of global ocean distribution. The basin includes the Chukchi Sea and Laptev Sea along its northern continental shelves. It is bordered by the Canadian Arctic archipelago on its western side. The Frame Strait provides a direct marine passage between the Arctic Ocean Basin and the North Atlantic sector. The Arctic Ocean Basin occupies a central position within the circumpolar northern marine domain. Interbasin separation lines designate the conventional boundaries between major ocean basins. These lines are defined by geographic reference points rather than by physical barriers. They are commonly represented on global maps to distinguish the Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Southern, and Arctic Ocean basins. The placement of these lines follows agreed cartographic standards. The boundary between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean basins is commonly drawn along the meridian passing south of Africa, near Cape Agulhas. The division between the Atlantic and Pacific basins in the southern hemisphere is typically aligned with the Drake Passage region. The separation between the Indian and Pacific basins is traced through the Indonesian archipelago. These delineations correspond to recognized marine passages and straits. The boundary between the Arctic and Atlantic basins is often placed along lines crossing the Greenland Sea and the Norwegian Sea. The division between the Arctic and Pacific basins is commonly identified at the Bering Strait. The Southern Ocean Basin is defined by a circumpolar latitude, and this latitude also serves as a separation line from the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins. Interbasin separation lines provide a standardized framework for naming and mapping global ocean areas. They are applied consistently across hemispheres. These lines establish distinct geographic extents for each named basin without implying structural barriers. Cartographic institutions publish official coordinate references for these separations. The International Hydrographic Organization maintains widely cited boundary descriptions. These descriptions are expressed using meridians, parallels, and defined coastal reference points. Interbasin separation lines may intersect at shared marine junctions. Each line is positioned to preserve clear hemispheric and basin identification across global charts. Continental boundary interfaces mark the zones where major ocean basins meet continental landmasses. These interfaces are defined by coastal outlines and adjacent marine margins. Each named ocean basin is bordered by specific continental regions across distinct hemispheric sectors. The configuration of these interfaces contributes to the global arrangement of ocean distribution. The Pacific Ocean Basin interfaces with the western coasts of North and South America and with the eastern margins of Asia and Australia. The Atlantic Ocean Basin is bordered by the eastern coasts of the Americas and the western coasts of Europe and Africa. The Indian Ocean Basin aligns with eastern Africa, southern Asia, and western Australia. The Arctic Ocean Basin meets the northern continental margins of North America, Europe, and Asia. The Southern Ocean Basin surrounds Antarctica along a continuous polar coastline. Continental boundary interfaces vary in longitudinal orientation. Some follow extended north-south alignments, while others trace curved or irregular coastal geometries. These interfaces occur across both the eastern and western hemispheres. They establish the outer limits of each ocean basin against terrestrial landforms. Major peninsulas, archipelagos, and enclosed seas are positioned along several continental margins. These features are situated at the edges of larger basin extents. Continental boundary interfaces form part of the cartographic framework used to delineate ocean basins globally. They provide fixed geographic references for the spatial separation of marine and terrestrial domains. Elongated basin forms are characterized by a dominant length dimension that exceeds their average width. These basins display extended north, south, or east-west orientations across large geographic spans. Their outlines appear stretched along a principal axis when viewed on global maps. The longitudinal or latitudinal reach of these basins defines their overall configuration. The Atlantic Ocean Basin presents a prominent example of an elongated form aligned primarily along a north-south axis. Its boundaries follow continental margins that reinforce its linear appearance. The basin maintains a relatively narrow width compared to its total meridional extent. This proportion contributes to its classification as an elongated basin. Elongated basin forms often extend across multiple climatic zones and hemispheric divisions. Their principal axis may cross equatorial regions while reaching toward polar latitudes. The continuity of their outline is visible across broad geographic intervals. Their shape is identifiable without reference to internal structures. On global projections, elongated basins contrast with more rounded or irregular configurations. Their margins tend to follow extended coastal contours. The axial orientation remains a defining visual feature in cartographic representations. Elongated basin forms represent one category within large-scale ocean basin geometry. Some elongated basins display gradual changes in width along their principal axis. Others maintain a relatively consistent lateral span across long distances. The orientation of these basins may align with meridians or follow slight angular deviations. Their outer boundaries are typically traced along continental margins or designated separation lines. Elongated basin forms are observable across both hemispheres. Their stretched configuration is apparent in small-scale global maps, as well as in detailed regional charts. The distinction between length and width remains the primary geometric attribute in their classification. Circular basin forms are characterized by a relatively balanced proportion between length and width. These basins display outlines that approximate rounded or oval configurations on global maps. Their horizontal dimensions do not emphasize a single dominant axis. The perimeter tends to curve gradually around a central area. Circular basin forms may occupy enclosed or semi-enclosed geographic settings. Their margins often trace broad arcs rather than extended linear alignments. The overall geometry appears compact when compared to elongated basin categories. The distribution of boundary segments contributes to a near equidistant span across multiple directions. On cartographic projections, circular basin forms present a centralized outline with minimal directional bias. Their shape may resemble a broad oval rather than a stretched corridor. The lateral and longitudinal extents remain relatively comparable. This proportional balance distinguishes them from more linear basin types. Some circular basin forms are positioned between surrounding landmasses that frame their curved perimeter. Others are defined by separation lines that complete a rounded outline. The continuity of their boundary follows a smooth sequence of arcs. The overall configuration remains identifiable without reference to internal subdivisions. Circular basin forms represent one category within large-scale ocean basin geometry. Their rounded tendencies are visible across small-scale global representations. The absence of a pronounced axial orientation serves as a primary geometric feature. This shape classification relies solely on outline configuration and spatial proportion. Semi-enclosed basin forms are characterized by partial confinement by surrounding landmasses. These basins are bordered on multiple sides by continental margins or island chains. An opening to a larger oceanic domain remains present along one or more boundary segments. The overall outline reflects a combination of enclosure and external connection. The perimeter of semi-enclosed basins often follows irregular coastal contours. Their shape may resemble a broad indentation within a larger ocean basin. The opening to adjacent waters is typically narrower than the enclosed span. This geometric relationship contributes to a distinct visual profile on global maps. Semi-enclosed basin forms may appear rounded, oval, or irregular in plan view. Their enclosed sides tend to form curved or segmented arcs along continental boundaries. The open side connects to a principal ocean basin through defined with feeling the deepest passages of no more objects. In the fact, the contrast between enclosed and open segments defines the large-scale outline. On cartographic representations, semi-enclosed basins are identifiable by the presence of surrounding land on several sides. Their spatial extent is generally more limited than that of fully open ocean basins. The degree of enclosure varies among examples, yet the structural pattern remains consistent. Semi-enclosed basin forms represent a recognized category within basin shape classifications. Their defining characteristic is the combination of partial land confinement and external marine linkage. The geometry of these basins is determined by outline configuration rather than by internal structure. Multi-lobed basin forms are characterized by the presence of several broad extensions projecting from a central marine area. These basins display outlines composed of multiple rounded or irregular segments. Each lobe occupies a distinct directional span while remaining connected to the main basin body. The overall configuration reflects a composite shape rather than a single continuous curve. The perimeter of multi-lobed basins often alternates between inward indentations and outward projections. These variations create a segmented outline visible on global maps. Individual lobes may differ in size and orientation. The spatial distribution of these lobes contributes to an asymmetrical appearance. Multi-lobed basin forms may extend across different longitudinal sectors. Some lobes align with adjacent continental margins, while others open toward broader oceanic areas. The central portion of the basin connects the lobes into a unified marine domain. The geometry remains identifiable through the repetition of expanded segments around a core region. On cartographic representations, multi-lobe basins contrast with simpler elongated or circular forms. Their boundaries trace a sequence of arcs and recesses. The outline cannot be reduced to a single dominant axis or uniform curvature. The arrangement of lobes defines the large-scale shape tendency. Multi-lobed basin forms represent one category within basin shape classifications. Their defining attribute is the presence of multiple prominent expansions within a shared boundary. The classification is based solely on large-scale outline configuration and spatial distribution. Marginal basin forms are positioned along the edges of major ocean basins adjacent to continental or island arc boundaries. These basins occupy peripheral locations rather than central oceanic areas. Their outlines are influenced by nearby landmasses that frame one or more sides. An opening to a larger ocean basin remains present along their outer margin. The perimeter of marginal basins often follows irregular coastal contours. Island chains or peninsulas may partially define their boundaries. The enclosed portion typically faces inland toward a continental margin. The open side connects to a broader oceanic domain. Marginal basin forms vary in overall geometry. Some display elongated outlines parallel to continental coasts. Others appear more rounded or segmented, depending on surrounding land configuration. The spatial extent of marginal basins is generally smaller than that of primary ocean basins. On global maps, marginal basins are identifiable by their position along basin edges. Their outlines are shaped by adjacent geographic features, rather than by central oceanic expanses. The transition from marginal basin to major basin is marked by designated marine passages or open boundary segments. Marginal basin forms represent one category within large-scale basin shape classifications. Their defining attribute is peripheral placement, combined with partial enclosure by land. The classification is based solely on external configuration and positional context within the global ocean framework and mapped global ocean divisions. Marginal basin forms are distributed across multiple oceanic regions. Their occurrence is common along Western Pacific and Eastern Atlantic margins. The outline of each marginal basin reflects the adjacent continental geometry. The overall configuration remains identifiable at small global scales and in regional charts. Linear basin alignments are characterized by a pronounced directional orientation along a relatively straight axis. These basins display outlines that extend predominantly in one consistent geographic direction. Their margins often trace elongated boundary segments with limited lateral deviation. The overall configuration emphasizes continuity along a single alignment. The primary axis of linear basin alignments may follow a north, south, or east-west orientation. In some cases, the alignment appears slightly oblique relative to meridians or parallels. The dominant axis remains visually identifiable on global maps. The proportion between length and width reinforces the linear tendency. Linear basin alignments differ from multi-lobed or circular forms in their reduced curvature along major boundary segments. Their perimeters may include minor indentations, yet the general outline maintains a stretched appearance. The spatial distribution extends across broad geographic intervals without significant outward expansions. The shape remains coherent along its principal direction. On cartographic projections, linear basin alignments are distinguishable by their streamlined configuration. The boundary traces a path that appears merely continuous across long distances. Continental margins, or designated separation lines, may reinforce the linear outline. The alignment remains a defining geometric attribute. Linear basin alignments represent one category within large-scale basin shape classifications. Their identification relies on dominant axial orientation and extended boundary continuity. The classification is based solely on large-scale outline tendencies, observable in mapped ocean basin geometry. Northern Hemisphere basin presence includes portions of several major ocean basins distributed above the equatorial line. The Pacific Ocean Basin extends into northern latitudes across both western and eastern sectors. The Atlantic Ocean Basin occupies a substantial area north of the equator between the Americas and Europe and Africa. The Arctic Ocean Basin is located entirely within the Northern Hemisphere. The North Pacific sector spans from equatorial regions toward high northern latitudes near the Arctic boundary. The North Atlantic sector extends from the equator to marine areas adjacent to the Arctic region. These northern portions are separated from their southern counterparts by the equatorial division. The Arctic Ocean Basin forms the most poleward marine domain in this hemisphere. Northern Hemisphere basin presence is distributed across both the eastern and western hemispheres. Large continental landmasses frame significant portions of northern ocean areas. The configuration of northern basins reflects the arrangement of surrounding continents. Marginal seas and enclosed marine regions are common along northern continental margins. The spatial allocation of ocean basins in the Northern Hemisphere includes open ocean expanses and semi-enclosed areas. The distribution spans multiple longitudinal sectors from the Western Pacific to the Eastern Atlantic. The hemispheric placement establishes a defined geographic pattern across northern latitudes. The Indian Ocean basin has limited presence north of the equator compared to the Pacific and Atlantic sectors. Northern Hemisphere basin presence includes extensive coastal interfaces along North America, Europe, and Asia. Several straits and narrow passages connect northern basins to adjacent marine regions. The geographic spread across northern latitudes contributes to a broad east-west distribution of oceanic areas above the equatorial boundary. Southern Hemisphere basin presence includes extensive portions of several major ocean basins located below the equatorial line. The Pacific Ocean basin occupies a broad expanse across southern latitudes in both eastern and western sectors. The Atlantic Ocean basin extends southward between South America and Africa. The Indian Ocean basin is predominantly situated within the southern hemisphere. The South Pacific sector spans from the equator toward high southern latitudes adjacent to the Southern Ocean. The South Atlantic sector extends from equatorial regions toward the marine areas surrounding Antarctica. The Indian Ocean basin covers large areas south of the equator between Africa and Australia. These southern portions are separated from their northern counterparts by the equatorial division. The Southern Ocean basin is located entirely within the Southern Hemisphere. It encircles Antarctica across all longitudinal sectors. This basin forms the most poleward marine domain in the southern latitudinal range. Its circumpolar distribution links southern sectors of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins. Southern Hemisphere basin presence is distributed across both the eastern and western hemispheres. Large oceanic expanses dominate this hemisphere relative to continental land area. The spatial allocation spans tropical, subtropical, and high southern latitudes without reference to climatic classification. The hemispheric placement establishes a continuous marine distribution across southern geographic sectors. The Southern Pacific and Southern Atlantic sectors occupy wide longitudinal intervals across open ocean areas. The Indian Ocean basin extends southward to designated circumpolar boundaries. Southern Hemisphere basin presence includes extensive open ocean domains between Africa, Australia, and South America. The geographic spread across southern latitudes reflects a broad marine allocation below the equatorial boundary. Equatorial basin distribution refers to the presence of major ocean basins along the equatorial line. The Pacific Ocean basin spans a wide interval across equatorial latitudes in both eastern and western sectors. The Atlantic Ocean basin crosses the equator between South America and Africa. The Indian Ocean basin also extends across equatorial regions between Africa and Southeast Asia. The equatorial line divides the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins into northern and southern sectors. Each of these basins maintains continuous marine areas on both sides of the equator. The Arctic Ocean basin does not extend to equatorial latitudes. The Southern Ocean basin is positioned entirely south of the equator. Equatorial basin distribution is observable across multiple longitudinal zones. The Pacific sector occupies a broad central position across equatorial latitudes. The Atlantic sector forms a narrower equatorial corridor between adjacent continental margins. The Indian sector spans equatorial waters between eastern Africa and the Indonesian region. The geographic spread along the equator includes open ocean expanses and adjacent marginal seas. Continental land masses approach but do not fully interrupt equatorial marine continuity. The equatorial distribution of ocean basins establishes a continuous band of marine territory encircling the globe. This allocation reflects hemispheric division without reference to climatic or circulation characteristics. The equatorial Pacific occupies the largest continuous marine area along the equator. The equatorial Atlantic is comparatively narrower in longitudinal extent. The equatorial Indian Ocean forms a distinct segment between Africa and the Indian Ocean archipelago. Equatorial basin distribution spans both the eastern and western hemispheres across multiple mapped ocean divisions. Polar basin coverage refers to the distribution of ocean basins across high northern and high southern latitudes. The Arctic Ocean basin occupies the central marine area surrounding the North Pole. It is confined entirely to the northern hemisphere. Its coverage spans across all longitudinal sectors within polar latitudes. The Southern Ocean basin encircles Antarctica across high southern latitudes. It is situated entirely within the southern hemisphere. This basin forms a continuous circumpolar marine zone. Its coverage extends across the full range of meridians around the Antarctic continent. Portions of the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean basins extend into northern polar latitudes through adjacent marine sectors. These extensions approach the boundary of the Arctic region. In the southern hemisphere, the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins connect to the Southern Ocean at high latitudes. Their southern limits align with designated circumpolar boundaries. Polar basin coverage is defined by hemispheric placement and geographic latitude. The Arctic and Southern Ocean basins represent the primary polar marine domains. The distribution across both poles establishes a bilateral pattern of ocean presence at extreme latitudes. This allocation reflects global ocean geometry without reference to circulation or climatic conditions. Northern polar coverage includes marine areas adjacent to Greenland, northern Canada, and Siberia. Southern polar coverage surrounds the Antarctic continental margin across all longitudes. The extent of polar basin presence is continuous around Antarctica and centralized around the North Pole. These high-latitude distributions remain distinct from equatorial and mid-latitude ocean allocations. Trans-equatorial basin continuity refers to the uninterrupted extension of major ocean basins across the equatorial line. The Pacific Ocean basin maintains continuous marine coverage from northern to southern latitudes without interruption at the equator. The Atlantic Ocean basin also spans the equatorial boundary between the Americas and Africa. The Indian Ocean basin extends across the equator between eastern Africa and the Indonesian region. In each of these basins, the equatorial line functions as a hemispheric divider rather than a structural boundary. Marine areas remain physically continuous across this latitude. Northern and southern sectors of the same basin are connected by open ocean. The geographic configuration supports a unified basin identity on both sides of the equator. Trans-equatorial continuity is observable across multiple longitudinal sectors. The Pacific presents the broadest equatorial span, with open ocean coverage extending across central longitudes. The Atlantic forms a narrower equatorial corridor, aligned between continental margins. The Indian Ocean displays a continuous equatorial segment within its western and central sectors. The Arctic Ocean basin does not exhibit trans-equatorial continuity, as it is confined to northern latitudes. The Southern Ocean basin is positioned entirely south of the equator and does not cross it. Trans-equatorial basin continuity therefore applies to selected major basins within the global ocean framework. This pattern reflects geographic spread and hemispheric allocation without reference to climatic or circulation characteristics. Basin-to-continent spacing refers to the geographic distance and arrangement between major ocean basins and adjacent continental landmasses. The Pacific Ocean basin occupies broad intervals between the western coasts of the Americas and the eastern margins of Asia and Australia. The Atlantic Ocean basin is positioned between the Americas and the combined landmasses of Europe and Africa. The Indian Ocean Basin lies between Eastern Africa, Southern Asia, and Western Australia. The spacing between basins and continents varies across hemispheres. In the Northern Hemisphere, continental land masses are closely aligned with ocean basin margins. In the Southern Hemisphere, wider oceanic expanses separate continental outlines across certain longitudinal sectors. The Southern Ocean Basin circles Antarctica, with no intervening continental barriers beyond the Antarctic margin. Basin-to-continent spacing is observable on global maps through the relative width of oceanic intervals between land boundaries. Some basins display narrow separations where continents approach one another. Others exhibit extensive open ocean distances between opposing continental margins. These variations are distributed unevenly across longitudes. The spatial relationship between ocean basins and continents contributes to the overall pattern of global ocean allocation. Each major basin occupies a defined interval bounded by terrestrial edges. The arrangement of continents establishes the outer limits of basin extents without reference to internal processes. Basin-to-continent spacing remains a geographic characteristic within the broader framework of ocean basin distribution. Oceanic surface coverage ratios refer to the proportional distribution of ocean basin areas across the Earth's surface. The Pacific Ocean Basin accounts for the largest share of total ocean surface area. The Atlantic Ocean Basin represents a smaller but substantial portion of global marine coverage. The Indian Ocean Basin occupies a moderate share relative to the Pacific and Atlantic. The Southern Ocean Basin contributes additional surface coverage concentrated in high southern latitudes. The Arctic Ocean Basin represents the smallest portion among the major named basins. These coverage ratios reflect geographic allocation rather than climatic or circulation characteristics. Each basin occupies a defined fraction of the global ocean surface. Oceanic surface coverage ratios vary between hemispheres. The southern hemisphere contains a greater proportion of ocean surface area relative to land. The northern hemisphere exhibits a more balanced distribution between continental and oceanic surfaces. The relative area of each basin contributes to this hemispheric allocation. The Pacific Basin spans the widest longitudinal range, increasing its overall surface proportion. The Atlantic Basin forms a narrower corridor yet extends across a broad north-south interval. The Indian Basin occupies a distinct sector between Africa, Asia, and Australia. Oceanic surface coverage ratios provide a quantitative representation of spatial distribution within the global ocean framework. The combined surface area of all ocean basins exceeds that of continental land masses. Variations in basin size contribute to differences in mapped ocean proportions across longitudes. The distribution of surface coverage remains consistent across standard global projections. These ratios describe spatial allocation without reference to internal basin structure or dynamic systems. Western sub-basin divisions refer to regional subdivisions located along the western sectors of major ocean basins. These divisions include marginal seas, semi-enclosed basins, and distinct sub-basin regions positioned adjacent to continental margins or island arcs. Their spatial arrangement forms part of the broader intra-basin structure within global ocean geometry. In the Pacific Ocean Basin, western sub-basin divisions include the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and the Sea of Japan. These regions are situated between East and Southeast Asia and offshore island chains. In the Atlantic Ocean Basin, western subdivisions include the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. These areas are positioned between North and South America and adjacent island arcs. The Indian Ocean Basin also contains western sub-basin divisions, such as the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea. These regions are located between Eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. The Arctic Ocean Basin includes western subdivisions adjacent to the Canadian Arctic Archipelago and Greenland. These sub-basin divisions remain connected to the larger basin while maintaining distinct geographic boundaries. Western sub-basin divisions are typically bounded on one side by continental land masses and on another by island chains or open ocean segments. Their outlines vary from elongated to irregular forms, depending on surrounding geographic features. These subdivisions are recognized in cartographic classifications of ocean basin structure. The distribution of western sub-basin divisions reflects hemispheric allocation and continental adjacency. They form identifiable regional components within larger ocean basins. Their classification is based on horizontal extent and geographic placement, rather than vertical structure. Eastern sub-basin divisions refer to regional subdivisions located along the eastern sectors of major ocean basins. These divisions include marginal seas, semi-enclosed basins, and distinct sub-basin regions positioned adjacent to continental margins or transitional marine corridors. Their spatial arrangement forms part of the intra-basin subdivision structure within global ocean geometry. In the Pacific Ocean Basin, eastern sub-basin divisions are generally less enclosed than their western counterparts, but include regions such as the Gulf of California and coastal marine areas along the western margins of North and South America. These areas are situated between continental coastlines and the broader open Pacific. In the Atlantic Ocean Basin, eastern subdivisions include the Mediterranean Sea and the Baltic Sea. These enclosed and semi-enclosed seas are positioned between Europe, Africa, and adjacent landmasses. The Indian Ocean Basin contains eastern sub-basin divisions near the Indonesian archipelago and along the western margin of Australia. These regions are connected to the broader basin through designated marine passages. The Arctic Ocean Basin includes eastern subdivisions along the Siberian margin, such as the Laptev Sea and the East Siberian Sea. These areas remain connected to the central Arctic domain. Eastern sub-basin divisions are typically bounded on one side by continental landmasses and on another by open ocean segments or straits. Their outlines vary from elongated to irregular, depending on surrounding geographic features. These subdivisions are recognized in cartographic classifications of ocean basin structure. The distribution of eastern sub-basin divisions reflects continental adjacency and hemispheric placement. They form identifiable regional components within larger ocean basins. Their classification is based on horizontal extent and geographic configuration rather than vertical layering or sediment characteristics. Marginal sea regions are semi-enclosed marine areas located along the edges of major ocean basins. These regions are typically bordered by continental landmasses, island arcs, or peninsulas on multiple sides. An opening to a larger ocean basin remains present through straits or broader marine corridors. Their configuration forms part of the intra-basin subdivision structure. In the Pacific Ocean Basin, marginal sea regions include the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Sea of Japan. These areas are positioned between East and Southeast Asia and adjacent island chains. In the Atlantic Ocean Basin, marginal sea regions include the Caribbean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. These seas are situated between continental margins and connected to the open Atlantic through defined passages. The Indian Ocean Basin contains marginal sea regions, such as the Arabian Sea and the Andaman Sea. These regions lie between Eastern Africa, Southern Asia, and island archipelagos. The Arctic Ocean Basin includes marginal seas along its continental margins, including the Barents Sea and the Beaufort Sea. These seas remain connected to the central Arctic domain. Marginal sea regions vary in shape from elongated to irregular forms. Their boundaries are defined by coastal outlines and marine passages rather than by internal structural features. The degree of enclosure differs among examples, yet each maintains a connection to a principal ocean basin. Marginal sea regions are recognized as distinct subdivisions within larger ocean basins. Their classification is based on horizontal extent and geographic configuration. These regions contribute to the overall structural organization of ocean basin geometry, without reference to vertical layering or sediment profiles. Enclosed sea areas are marine regions largely surrounded by continental landmasses with limited connections to major ocean basins. These areas form part of the intra-basin subdivision structure within global ocean geometry. Their boundaries are defined primarily by surrounding coastlines, with one or more narrow straits providing access to adjacent oceanic domains. The degree of enclosure distinguishes them from broader marginal seas. The Mediterranean Sea represents a prominent, enclosed sea area, connected to the Atlantic Ocean through the Strait of Gibraltar. The Black Sea is connected to the Mediterranean through the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. The Red Sea is bordered by northeastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and connects to the Indian Ocean through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. These regions remain geographically distinct while maintaining marine linkage. Enclosed sea areas are typically positioned along continental margins rather than in central oceanic expanses. Their surface extent is smaller than that of primary ocean basins. The outlines of enclosed seas often follow irregular coastal contours shaped by adjacent land masses. The configuration reflects strong horizontal confinement. In the Arctic region, enclosed sea areas include segments along the Siberian and North American margins that are bordered by extensive land. These seas connect to the broader Arctic domain through designated passages. A spatial arrangement of enclosed sea areas contributes to the layered subdivision of ocean basins. Enclosed sea areas are classified based on horizontal configuration and degree of land enclosure. Their identification relies on geographic placement and boundary definition. This classification excludes vertical layering and sediment characteristics, while focusing on surface extent and marine conductivity. Shelf edge delineations refer to the horizontal boundary zones that separate continental shelf regions from deeper basin areas within major ocean basins. These delineations form part of the intra-basin subdivision structure observable in mapped ocean geometry. The shelf edge traces the outer margin of broad, shallow marine platforms that extend from continental coastlines. Beyond this boundary, the basin transitions into more expansive oceanic areas. Shelf edge delineations are distributed along continental margins across all major ocean basins. In the Pacific Ocean Basin, they follow the western coasts of the Americas and the eastern coasts of Asia and Australia. In the Atlantic Ocean Basin, they trace the eastern margins of North and South America and the western margins of Europe and Africa. In the Indian Ocean Basin, shelf edges extend along eastern Africa, southern Asia, and western Australia. These delineations often appear as curving lines that parallel continental coastlines. Their configuration reflects the outline of adjacent landmasses. Shelf edge zones vary in width, depending on regional geography. Some margins exhibit broad shelf expanses, while others display relatively narrow shelf regions. Shelf edge delineations contribute to the structural organization of subbasins and marginal seas. They mark a horizontal transition within the basin's surface framework. Enclosed and semi-enclosed seas may include shelf edge segments along their boundaries. The identification of shelf edge delineations relies on mapped geographic extent rather than vertical layering or sediment composition. Central basin expanses refer to the broad open ocean areas located away from continental margins and enclosed sea regions within major ocean basins. These expanses occupy the interior portions of basin geometry. Their surface extent is defined by distance from surrounding land masses. and marginal subdivisions. The configuration forms a continuous marine area within each principal basin. In the Pacific Ocean basin, central expanses extend across wide longitudinal intervals between the Americas and Asia, Australia. These regions include large, unreinterrupted surface areas positioned far from coastal boundaries. In the Atlantic Ocean basin, central expanses are situated between the eastern coasts of the Americas and the western coasts of Europe and Africa. The Indian Ocean basin contains central expanses between eastern Africa and western Australia, across equatorial and southern latitudes. Central basin expanses are not enclosed by continental landmasses. Their boundaries are established by the outer limits of subbasins, marginal seas, and continental shelf regions. The outline of these expanses reflects the overall geometry of the parent basin. Their shape may appear elongated, rounded, or irregular, depending on basin configuration. These expanses form the largest continuous surface areas within individual ocean basins. They are distributed across multiple hemispheres in basins that cross the equator. Central basin expanses contribute to the internal subdivision structure by contrasting with peripheral and enclosed marine regions. Their identification is based on horizontal position and surface extent rather than on vertical layering or sediment characteristics. Basin-to-basin adjacency refers to the geographic positioning of major ocean basins in direct contact with one another along defined boundaries. These adjacencies are established through shared margins, designated separation lines, or ocean gateways. The Pacific, Atlantic, Indian, Southern, and Arctic ocean basins occupy contiguous positions within the global ocean framework. Their boundaries meet along mapped reference lines rather than physical barriers. The Pacific Ocean basin is adjacent to the Atlantic basin at high southern latitudes through the Drake Passage region. The Atlantic basin is contiguous with the Indian basin near the southern tip of Africa along a meridian-based boundary. The Indian basin is adjacent to the Pacific basin through marine passages in the Indonesian region. These adjacencies form a continuous chain of basin contact across multiple longitudinal sectors. The Arctic Ocean basin is adjacent to the Atlantic basin through the Greenland Sea and Norwegian Sea corridors. It is also adjacent to the Pacific basin through the Bering Strait. The Southern Ocean basin is contiguous with the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins along its circumpolar boundary. This positioning places the Southern basin in contact with three major basins simultaneously. Basin-to-basin adjacency is defined by horizontal boundary alignment and gateway positioning. These adjacencies occur across both hemispheres. The arrangement establishes a connected network of basins within the global ocean surface. The classification of adjacency relies on mapped boundary lines and contiguous marine margins without reference to internal processes or comparative evaluation. Oceanic gateway locations are defined marine passages that connect adjacent ocean basins along shared boundaries. These gateways form part of the relative positioning structure within global ocean geometry. Their placement is determined by continental margins, island chains, and mapped separation lines. Each gateway provides a direct surface connection between two major basins. The Drake Passage functions as a gateway between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean basins at high southern latitudes. The Bering Strait connects the Pacific and Arctic Ocean basins in northern latitudes. The Strait of Gibraltar links the Atlantic Ocean basin to the Mediterranean Sea, which is an enclosed sea area within the broader Atlantic domain. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean basin. In the Indonesian region, multiple marine passages connect the Indian and Pacific Ocean basins. These include straits between island chains that define the boundary between the two basins. The Fram Strait provides a connection between the Arctic Ocean basin and the North Atlantic sector. The Cape Agulhas region marks a boundary alignment between the Atlantic and Indian basins along southern Africa. Oceanic gateway locations are distributed across both hemispheres. Their geographic placement corresponds to narrow marine corridors or defined boundary intersections. These gateways are identifiable on global maps as points of basin adjacency. The classification of oceanic gateway locations is based on horizontal position and basin connectivity, without reference to internal dynamics or comparative assessment. Strait-connected basins are ocean basins that maintain direct geographic linkage through narrow marine passages. These connections occur where continental margins or island chains create constricted corridors between larger water bodies. The straits function as defined boundary intersections within the framework of relative basin positioning. Their location establishes formal adjacency between named ocean basins. The Pacific and Arctic Ocean basins are connected through the Bering Strait at high northern latitudes. The Atlantic and Arctic basins are linked through corridors, including the Fram Strait between Greenland and Svalbard. The Pacific and Atlantic basins are positioned in proximity near the southern tip of South America, where the Drake Passage provides a marine connection. The Indian and Pacific Ocean basins are connected through multiple straits within the Indonesian archipelago. These passages are situated between island chains that define the boundary between the two basins. The Atlantic and Mediterranean regions are connected through the Strait of Gibraltar, linking the Atlantic basin to an enclosed sea within its broader domain. The Red Sea connects to the Indian Ocean basin through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Strait-connected basins are identifiable on global maps by the presence of narrow marine corridors between larger expanses. These connections occur in both hemispheres across different longitudinal sectors. The geographic position of each strait defines the boundary alignment between adjacent basins. Strait-connected basins form part of the contiguous global ocean surface without reference to internal dynamics or comparative assessment. Continental margin adjacency refers to the spatial relationship between major ocean basins and the bordering edges of continental landmasses. Each ocean basin occupies a defined position relative to adjacent continental margins. These margins form the outer geographic limits of basin extent. The alignment between basin boundaries and continental coastlines is visible on global maps. The Pacific Ocean basin is adjacent to the western margins of North and South America and the eastern margins of Asia and Australia. The Atlantic Ocean basin lies between the eastern margins of the Americas and the western margins of Europe and Africa. The Indian Ocean basin is bordered by eastern Africa, southern Asia, and western Australia. The Arctic Ocean basin is enclosed by the northern continental margins of North America, Europe, and Asia. The Southern Ocean basin surrounds the continental margin of Antarctica. Continental margin adjacency varies across hemispheres. In the northern hemisphere, extensive continental landmasses border large segments of ocean basins. In the southern hemisphere, broader oceanic intervals separate continental outlines in certain longitudinal sectors. The arrangement of continents determines where basin boundaries align with terrestrial edges. These adjacencies are defined by contiguous margins rather than by structural transitions within the ocean interior. Continental margins and basin boundaries often coincide along mapped separation lines. The configuration establishes a continuous interface between marine and terrestrial domains. Continental margin adjacency forms part of the relative positioning framework within global ocean basin geometry. Polar interface zones refer to the boundary regions where major ocean basins meet high-latitude marine domains near the poles. These zones are defined by contiguous basin margins and designated circumpolar boundaries. In the northern hemisphere, the Arctic Ocean basin forms the central polar marine area, interfacing with the Atlantic and Pacific basins through mapped corridors. In the southern hemisphere, the Southern Ocean basin establishes a circumpolar interface with the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins. The Arctic interface zone includes boundary alignments through the Frame Strait and the Bering Strait. These corridors mark points of adjacency between the Arctic basin and neighboring ocean basins. Continental margins of North America, Greenland, and Eurasia form additional segments of the Arctic polar interface. The positioning of these margins establishes a defined northern boundary network. The southern polar interface zone follows a circumpolar latitude encircling Antarctica. This boundary functions as the contiguous margin between the Southern Ocean basin and the southern sectors of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian basins. The interface spans all longitudinal sectors, without interruption, by continental landmasses beyond Antarctica. Polar interface zones are distributed across both hemispheres. Their identification relies on mapped basin boundaries and gateway locations, rather than on internal basin characteristics. These zones represent areas of direct basin adjacency at extreme latitudes. The classification of polar interface zones is based on horizontal positioning within the global ocean framework and excludes cause-effect relationships or comparative evaluation. Inter-ocean boundary regions are geographic zones where the limits of two major ocean basins meet along mapped separation lines or marine corridors. These regions are defined by contiguous margins, meridian-based divisions, or identifiable gateway passages. Their placement forms part of the relative basin positioning structure within global ocean geometry. Each boundary region represents a horizontal transition between named ocean basins. One inter-ocean boundary region lies between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean basins near the southern tip of Africa. This boundary follows a meridian alignment extending southward into higher latitudes. Another boundary region is positioned between the Pacific and Atlantic basins near the southern extremity of South America in the Drake Passage sector. This region marks adjacency at high southern latitudes. The boundary between the Indian and Pacific Ocean basins is situated within the Indonesian archipelago. Multiple straits and passages define this inter-ocean region across equatorial latitudes. In the northern hemisphere, the Bering Strait marks the boundary region between the Pacific and Arctic basins. The Frame Strait defines a boundary region between the Arctic and Atlantic basins. Inter-ocean boundary regions occur across both hemispheres and span multiple longitudinal sectors. Their identification relies on mapped lines, straits, and contiguous marine margins. These regions establish the formal limits of adjacent ocean basins within the global ocean surface. The classification of inter-ocean boundary regions is based solely on geographic positioning and boundary definition, without reference to internal processes or comparative evaluation. Basin forms remain distributed across the planetary surface, without discrete limits. Geometric outlines persist as spatial arrangements rather than isolated structures. The pattern of distribution continues within the same uninterrupted expanse.